October 2019, they simulated a global coronavirus pandemic. 3 months later, it happened. Investigative journalist Whitney Webb spent years documenting a pattern so deliberate and repeatable that calling it a coincidence is no longer an option. But the people running the simulations call it preparedness. So who's lying?
Exercise. And most of these simulations I talked about just now are hosted or written or planned largely by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, as it's
January 2020, before the lockdowns, masks, and long before everything ground to a halt, one journalist was already writing about DARPA, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and gain-of-function research. Her publication refused to run it. And it was not because it was wrong.
and the craziness really, and they were worried about getting censored for putting it out, and I put it out on my friend's site, The Last American Vagabond.
That piece, published before the world even knew what COVID was, turned out to be right. The lab leak theory that got people banned, fired, and discredited in 2020 is now quietly accepted. But Webb makes it clear that the censorship was neither a mistake nor an overcalculation.
But in early 2020, people were getting censored, including like biggish sites like Zero Hedge, for example, for talking about things like the lab leak theory, which of course there's been a 180 on that since then.
Webb provides evidence that early treatments were either buried or discredited, while scientists were destroyed. Data was also manipulated, and every single intervention that could have saved lives either delayed or flat out ignored.
What we know now, and if it wasn't for the censorship and the smearing and all sorts of stuff, we would be in a very different situation, and most likely a lot more people would be alive right now. If things like early treatment hadn't been suppressed and all other sorts of policies hadn't been pushed through that we know now were completely ineffective.
Now that brings us to a major question. Who was coordinating it? More importantly, why did they need to go to such lengths just to make sure that the information is suppressed? Because as it stands, they had already written the script. They just needed to make sure nobody read it early.
Want to have my hands tied really when it came to writing about stuff that was developing with the COVID situation. Because, I think it was really important to take those risks, even though it meant deplatforming and stuff.
So what are they hiding? You see, before COVID, there were simulations. Not once, but multiple times. These simulations ran for over 2 decades. They were run by the same small group of people. And every time these people ran the simulations, they arrived at the same conclusions.
Oh, okay. So there was this fictitious scenario that was the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Open Philanthropy, which is Facebook co-founder Dustin Moskovitz, and it was basically simulating a novel coronavirus outbreak.
Webb does not stop at that. She provides more damning information.
That spreads around the world and necessitates censoring, misinformation, and lockdowns and all other sorts of stuff, and novel therapeutics and vaccines and whatever.
That was in October 2019, a whole 3 months before COVID exploded into a global pandemic. How did it dawn on these people that they could run a coronavirus pandemic simulation complete with censorship protocols and lockdown recommendations? Was it all a coincidence? But that's not even the disturbing part in this story.
The U.S. military, in conjunction with Robert Kadlec at HHS, ran something called Crimson Contagion throughout most of the year of 2019 that was also simulating a coronavirus. Oh, I think it was a pandemic influenza, but more or less some sort of coronavirus, outbreak globally that shuts everything.
That's a second pandemic simulation in 2019 alone. And before that, Webb mentions Clade X, held in 2018, Atlantic Storm in 2005, and Dark Winter in 2001, just months before the anthrax attacks. The same institution organized most of these simulations, and the same names were a common denominator in all of them.
If you're familiar with Event 201, you had Deputy Director of the CIA, Avril Haines, who, if I'm not mistaken, under Biden is currently Director of National Intelligence. So she's technically in charge of all 18 U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA.
Is it not interesting that the woman who simulated the pandemic response in October 2019 was somehow running all US intelligence by 2021? Do you still think these were just preparedness exercises?
And they have these sorts of, I would argue they're sort of baked in conclusions, and they conduct the simulation to justify why this solution is the best policy for something that hasn't happened yet. Like they're planning in advance the policies they want to enact on something.
Clearly, they were not preparing for a crisis. They were engineering consent for a response. But in the midst of all these, there is this question that seems to be slipping off. Who built the machine that makes all of this possible? Because COVID did not create these networks. These networks created COVID's response. And to find where they come from, Webb takes you back to the 1940s. You may, like many others, think corruption is a modern problem, a recent form of social rot. It is not.
With is talking about something called Operation Underworld. And this is when the U.S. intelligence apparatus, as it existed in the World War II era, they formally aligned themselves with organized crime, specifically the National Crime Syndicate, which was really a combination of the Jewish mob and the Italian mafia.
Out of that merger between the intelligence machinery and organized crime came the tool that still runs the world today.
How it developed, right? And one of the main tactics of this particular crime syndicate was sex blackmail, setting people up and blackmailing them. One of the first prominent people that was blackmailed by people like Mayor Lansky was J. Edgar Hoover, the director of that.
Imagine the most powerful law enforcement officer in America being controlled by the same people he was supposed to investigate. And so instead of dismantling organized crime, he resorted to the same technique on everyone else.
And so he had dossiers on friend and foe alike. I mean, it's well known that his office was just full of files on people, including extensive files on their sex lives.
This machine learned from itself, and by the 1980s, it had evolved into something with a new name, the Enterprise. And in Iran-Contra testimony, a CIA whistleblower described exactly what it had become.
He says it's a mix of Republicans, Democrats, mercenaries, ex officio mafia, and opportunists. They are CEOs, they are bankers, they are presidents, they own airlines, they own national television networks. They own 6 of the 7 video documentary companies in Washington, D.C.
The whistleblower went on to reveal more.
They do not give a damn about the law or the Constitution or the Congress or the oversight committees, except as something to be subverted, manipulated, and lied to. They abhor sunlight and love.
Simply put, that machine did not collapse or get dismantled. It just found a new face, one that the entire world would eventually know, and that face is where this story takes an even darker twist. According to Webb, mainstream media wants you to believe Epstein was an anomaly, a monster, and a closed case, but she has evidence pointing toward the contrary.
Obviously, someone like Epstein was allowed to operate the way he did with everyone knowing about it, with impunity, because he had a network of support. That network precedes Epstein by a number of years, and it continues to exist now that he's gone.
The real Epstein story is not the sex crimes, it's the money. Because Epstein was a serial financial criminal tied directly to the same machine we just described. He was Adnan Khashoggi's banker. Khashoggi was one of the central architects of Iran-Contra, and their shared bank, BCCI, was not really a bank.
BCCI, which was basically a private intelligence apparatus masquerading as a bank, and it collapsed in a spectacular fashion in 1991. But its origins go back to Pakistani intelligence and the CIA, and the bank itself was involved in the sex trafficking of minors.
From there, one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history, a White House fundraiser in 1993 where his name was dropped from a criminal case the same year. 17 meetings, all at the White House with a Clinton aide named Mark Middleton. And then, in 2022, after Middleton's Epstein ties were finally reported,
he ends up dead in May, hanging by the neck from a tree with an extension cord and a shotgun wound to the chest, and it's ruled a suicide. And no pictures and videos from the scene of his death are allowed to be publicly released. And why does no one in the U.S. media report on Mark Middleton's death except for local media in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Is it because the people who could cover it are the same people who need it buried?
Yeah, instead of doing anything with that client list, they destroy it.
I'm reading some of the chats on the
So,
Rumble.
that's just the history, right, of the FBI. And if you look at how the FBI has interacted with this group since Hoover, which is most of the FBI's history, they cover up for these interests.
The client list will never come out, and now the same network that protected Epstein, ran the blackmail operations, and financed covert wars off the books is building something new. Something that does not need blackmail anymore, because the control will be built into the infrastructure itself. Now, the simulations, blackmail, the captured institutions, and the censorship were never separate stories. Enter the National Security Commission on AI. And the people sitting in this commission have a proposal.
They say that the only way for the U.S. to maintain economic and military hegemony and beat China is to enact surveillance technology and this type of, control technology far beyond what we see in China today.
Webb also drops another bombshell.
You look at central bank digital currencies. The whole point of that is programmable money so that they can just turn off your money if you do the wrong thing. You support the wrong cause, your money's off, your bank account's gone. You can't.
And there is evidence to prove it.
And even if you don't do anything wrong, right? If you look at most of the pilots for central bank digital currencies right now, they have expiration dates, the money.
Canada's trucker protest was the proof of concept. The government simply froze bank accounts linked to protest organizers. No violence was needed. As Webb puts it, the destination is total compliance, one that's not enforced by soldiers, but by your phone, bank, and inability to buy basic necessities if you step out of line. And the manufactured misery is the bait designed to make the cage look like a refuge. So, what now?
Because all it is people have to get off their knees. People have to take responsibility for themselves and their communities and start building something else than a system that's run by criminals.
The receipts exist, the footnotes are documented, and the pattern is visible if you're willing to look. The only question now is whether enough people will look in time.